Before we begin tonight's story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been lost? Not just turned around for a moment, but truly, deeply lost, where the familiar suddenly becomes foreign and threatening. If you're watching from somewhere safe right now, take a moment to tell me in the comments, where are you? How far from civilization? How far from help? In 1907, Fayetteville, West Virginia, was already an established coal mining town, nestled in the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains. But beyond the modest main street and scattered company houses lay the vast wilderness that locals simply called the High Country. And rising above it all stood Crowley Ridge, a mountain that appeared on few maps and featured in fewer conversations. The locals had an unspoken agreement about Crowley. You simply didn't go there unless absolutely necessary. The Harlan family had lived in the shadow of Crowley Ridge for 3 generations. James Harlan, a foreman at the Whitewood Coal Company, his wife Sarah, and their 3 children, Robert, age 17, Mary, age 14, and young Thomas, just 9, occupied a 2-story clapboard house at the edge of town, where the road began its slow, winding ascent toward the mountain. From their kitchen window, Sarah could see the ridge line cutting against the sky like a jagged wound. She never looked at it directly, if she could help it. On April the 12th, 1907, Thomas Harlan walked to school as he did every morning, carrying his lunch pail and primer. The school day ended at 3 o'clock. By 3:30, all the other children had returned to their homes on the outskirts of town. Thomas never arrived. By 5 o'clock, Sarah Harlan was pacing their front porch. By 6, James had gathered 10 men to begin searching the road between the schoolhouse and home. By nightfall, more than 30 men were combing the woods with lanterns, calling the boy's name into the darkness. They found his lunch pail halfway between the school and the Harlan home, sitting neatly beside the road as if placed there deliberately. Inside, his sandwich remained half-eaten. His primer was nowhere to be found. What makes this case so disturbing isn't just that Thomas disappeared. It's that his disappearance was merely the first. The town of Fayetteville had grown accustomed to a certain rhythm. The men descended into the earth each morning, while the women maintained the homes and businesses above. Children attended the one-room schoolhouse near the center of town. On Sundays, nearly everyone gathered at the white-clapboard church to pray, socialize, and exchange the carefully filtered news of the week. What wasn't said during these gatherings often mattered more than what was. The Harlans were respected, if not particularly well-liked. James had risen to his position through a combination of hard work and a willingness to side with the company during the labor disputes that occasionally rippled through the mining communities. He was a stern man with a square jaw perpetually darkened by stubble, regardless of how recently he'd shaved. His eyes, deep-set and gray, rarely betrayed emotion. Sarah kept their home immaculate, the floors swept so regularly that the pine boards had begun to wear thin in the high-traffic areas. She preserved vegetables from their garden with methodical precision, the mason jars in their cellar, arranged by type and date. Her hands were raw from lye soap and perpetually busy, knitting, mending, cooking, cleaning, as if stillness might invite unwelcome thoughts. Their oldest son, Robert, worked alongside his father in the mine, though in a lesser position, a fact that seemed to chafe at him visibly. He had his father's build, but his mother's soft features, a combination that made him appear perpetually boyish despite his increasing responsibilities. Mary, their daughter, was quiet to the point of invisibility, moving through the house and town like a shadow, observing everything but commenting on little. And then there was Thomas, bright-eyed, quick to laugh, and possessed of a curiosity that frequently tested his mother's patience and his father's temper. He collected things, interesting stones, unusual feathers, discarded tools that he repurposed into toys. His pockets were always full, his mind always working. "That boy thinks too much," James would mutter after Thomas had asked a particularly probing question at dinner. 3 days before Thomas disappeared, the family had sat around their dinner table as usual. Sarah had prepared a rabbit stew, the meat tough but flavorful. Thomas had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the meal, pushing the food around his bowl rather than eating it. "Something wrong with the stew?" James had asked, his tone suggesting there had better not be. Thomas had shaken his head. "No, sir." Then, after a pause, "I saw something up on Crowley today." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the normal sounds of cutlery against bowls ceased. "You were up on Crowley?" Sarah's voice had cracked slightly. "Thomas, you know you're not to go up there alone." "I wasn't alone," Thomas had replied. "I was with Mr. Weaver." Another silence. Abel Weaver was the town's oldest resident, a solitary figure who lived in a small cabin just beyond the Presbyterian cemetery. He supplemented his miner's pension by guiding occasional hunting parties through the mountains and selling handcrafted furniture to the wealthier families in town. "What were you doing with old Weaver?" James had demanded. "He was showing me the caves," Thomas had said, excitement briefly overcoming his hesitation. "There's whole rooms under the mountain, Pa, and drawings on the walls. Old drawings. Mr. Weaver says they're Indian pictures from before." "That's enough," James had said sharply. "You're not to go up there again, you hear me? And you're to stay away from Weaver. The man's not right in the head." Thomas had nodded, eyes downcast. "Yes, sir." The conversation had moved on, but something had changed in the air of the Harlan household, a tension that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had always been there, but had suddenly become visible. The morning Thomas disappeared, Sarah later recalled, he had asked to stay home from school. "I don't feel right, Ma," he'd said, his face unusually pale. When she'd pressed her hand to his forehead, she'd found no fever. "You're fine," she'd told him, perhaps more sharply than necessary. "Now, get your things, you'll be late." Those were the last words she spoke to her son. "You'll be late." The memory of them would come to haunt her in the sleepless nights that followed. The search for Thomas continued for 7 days. Men from neighboring towns joined the effort. They combed the woods, checked abandoned mining shafts, dragged the New River. They found nothing. Sheriff William Donovan, a heavy-set man with a perpetually sweat-stained collar, personally led the group that visited Abel Weaver's cabin on the 2nd day. They found the old man sitting on his porch, whittling a piece of birch wood into what appeared to be a small human figure. "Heard you were up on Crowley with the Harlan boy recently," Donovan had said, without preamble. Weaver had nodded slowly, his knife never pausing in its steady, precise movements. Showed him the old caves. Boy was interested in history. Not many are these days. When was this exactly? 3, maybe 4 days back. "And you haven't seen him since?" Weaver had finally looked up, his roomy eyes narrowing slightly. "No." "Something happened to the boy?" The sheriff and his deputies had searched Weaver's cabin and the surrounding area. They'd found nothing to connect him to Thomas's disappearance, just the sparse possessions of an old man living alone. Still, suspicion had fallen on Weaver like a shadow, impossible to dispel entirely. On the 8th day, James Harlan had returned to work at the mine. There had been no discussion about this decision with his wife. He had simply risen before dawn, pulled on his work clothes, and left the house. Sarah had watched him from the window, his back straight, his movements mechanical. Robert had followed a few paces behind, his shoulders hunched as if against a bitter wind, though the morning had been mild. That evening, when they returned from the mine, coated in coal dust and fatigue, Sarah had been waiting at the door. "How could you?" she'd asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James had brushed past her without answering. Robert had at least had the decency to look ashamed. Mary had watched this exchange from the shadows of the hallway, her face expressionless. Later that night, Sarah had found her daughter sitting on Thomas's bed, running her fingers over his small collection of treasures, the feathers, stones, and bits of metal he had accumulated. When Sarah had entered, Mary had quickly closed the cigar box containing these items and slid it back under the bed. "He's not coming back, is he?" Mary had asked. Sarah had wanted to offer reassurance, to say what mothers are supposed to say in such situations. Instead, she had simply sat beside her daughter and placed a hand on her shoulder. They had remained that way until the room grew dark around them. Life in Fayetteville attempted to return to its normal rhythms. The mine operated, the school continued, Sunday services were held. But something had changed in the town. Mothers kept their children closer. Men walked straighter, eyes more alert. Conversations in the general store or post office would halt when strangers entered. The name Thomas Harlan was spoken less and less frequently, as if the very sound of it might summon whatever fate had befallen him. And then, 6 weeks after Thomas vanished, it happened again. Lily Mae Collins, age 12, disappeared while gathering blackberries along the edge of her family's property that backed up against the lower slopes of Crowley Ridge. She had set out with a small pail around noon. When she hadn't returned by mid-afternoon, her mother had gone looking. The pail had been found tipped over, berries scattered across the ground as if dropped suddenly. Like Thomas, Lily Mae seemed to have simply vanished. The town's response was immediate and frantic. The previous search parties reformed, this time with even more urgency and organization. The area where Lily Mae had disappeared was methodically divided into sections and combed by groups of men working in shifts. Dogs were brought in from neighboring Charleston to try to pick up her scent. Sheriff Donovan telegraphed for assistance from the state authorities. For 3 days, the search continued. On the 4th morning, one of the search parties made a discovery, not of Lily Mae, but of something perhaps more disturbing. About 2 miles from where the girl had last been seen, halfway up the slope of Crowley Ridge, they found a small cave entrance partially hidden by undergrowth. The entrance was narrow. A grown man would need to crawl to enter, but it appeared to widen once inside. Near the entrance, pressed into the soft earth, was a child's footprint. Beside it lay a single blackberry, shriveled but recognizable. 4 men, including Sheriff Donovan and James Harlan, who had insisted on joining this particular search party, entered the cave. They emerged 2 hours later, their faces ashen. They refused to discuss what they had found inside, but that evening, Sheriff Donovan telegraphed the state capitol, requesting additional officers and scientific experts. 3 days later, a Professor Edward Thornton arrived from the university in Morgantown. He was a thin, scholarly man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an air of detached curiosity that seemed almost offensive given the circumstances. He spent several hours in the cave, accompanied by the sheriff and 2 deputies. When they emerged, Thornton was carrying a small leather satchel that appeared to be full. That evening, a meeting was held in the town hall. Only adult men were permitted to attend. The windows were covered, and 2 deputies stood guard outside the doors. What was discussed at that meeting never became public knowledge, but those who attended emerged looking grim. Several immediately went to the saloon and drank until they were insensible. Others gathered their families and left town within days, offering no explanation beyond vague references to opportunities elsewhere. The search for Lily Mae Collins was officially called off 1 week after it began. Her parents, broken by grief, sold their property within a month and moved to Ohio to live with relatives. Before they left, Sarah Harlan had visited Mrs. Collins, bringing a cake as a pretense for the call. "Did they tell you what they found?" Sarah had asked once they were alone. Mrs. Collins had stared at her teacup for a long moment before answering, only that it wasn't her. A pause. Not all of it, anyway. Sarah had not asked for clarification. In the months that followed, a kind of nervous calm settled over Fayetteville. No more children disappeared, but parents no longer allowed their young ones to play unsupervised. The school implemented a new policy requiring students to walk in groups, and a town ordinance was passed establishing a curfew for anyone under 18. The caves on Crowley Ridge were declared off-limits, though no official reason was given. Abel Weaver, who had been viewed with suspicion but never formally accused, became a true outcast. Shopkeepers refused to serve him, forcing him to travel to neighboring towns for supplies. Children threw stones at his cabin. One night in late July, someone set fire to his woodshed. The volunteer fire brigade made only a token effort to extinguish the blaze. Through all of this, the Harlan family existed in a state of suspended animation. James worked longer hours at the mine, often volunteering for the most dangerous tasks. Robert followed his father's example. though without the same reckless disregard for safety. Sarah maintained their home with mechanical precision, but the light had gone out of her eyes, and Mary, quiet, watchful Mary, seemed to withdraw further into herself with each passing day. October brought the first frost and, with it, a stranger to Fayetteville. He arrived on the afternoon train, a tall man in a well-cut suit that immediately marked him as an outsider. He carried a leather briefcase and introduced himself at the hotel as Jonathan Pierce, a journalist from Pittsburgh. Pierce spent his first day in town asking questions at the general store, the post office, and the hotel, casual inquiries about local history, the mining industry, the community. By evening, word of his presence and apparent interest had spread throughout Fayetteville. When he entered the saloon that night, conversations dimmed momentarily before resuming at a more measured pace. Sheriff Donovan approached Pierce's table directly. "Help you with something, mister?" he asked, making no effort to disguise the wariness in his tone. Pierce smiled pleasantly. "Just researching an article on the mining communities of West Virginia. Fascinating history in these mountains." "That so?" Donovan replied. "Well, you'll find we're pretty much like any other mining town. Nothing special to report." "On the contrary," Pierce said, taking a small notebook from his pocket, "I find Fayetteville quite unique. For instance, I'm curious about the unusually high rate of population departure over the past 6 months, and about the stories I've heard regarding disappearances on Crowley Ridge." The saloon went silent. "Don't know where you're getting your information," Donovan said after a moment, "but I think you've been misled. We've had a few families move on, sure. Nature of mining work. People follow the jobs. As for Crowley," he shrugged, "just a mountain. Nothing special about it." Pierce had nodded, making a show of noting the sheriff's comments. "Of course. Perhaps I've been misinformed, though I would be interested in speaking with the Harlan family. I understand they suffered a loss earlier this year." Donovan's hand had moved to rest on his holstered pistol, a gesture not lost on Pierce or anyone else in the saloon. "The Harlans have been through enough without some city journalist dredging up their grief for a story. I'd suggest you focus your article elsewhere. In fact, I'd suggest you consider moving on to another town entirely. Not much of interest here in Fayetteville for your readers." Pierce had thanked the sheriff for his input and finished his drink in thoughtful silence. He had not asked any further questions that evening, but neither had he left town the next morning, as many had hoped. Instead, he had walked to the Harlan house shortly after James and Robert had left for the mine. Sarah had refused to open the door despite his repeated knocks. As he turned to leave, however, he noticed a pale face watching him from an upstairs window. Mary Harlan, her expression unreadable behind the glass. Pierce had walked into town, had lunch at the hotel restaurant, and then spent the afternoon writing in his room. As dusk approached, he had set out again, this time following the road that led toward the cemetery, and beyond it, Abel Weaver's cabin. The old man had been sitting on his porch, just as he had been when the sheriff's posse had arrived months earlier. He was whittling again, though this time the wood was taking the shape of what appeared to be a bird in flight. "Mr. Weaver," Pierce had said by way of greeting, "my name is Jonathan Pierce. I'm a journalist from Pittsburgh." "I know who you are," Weaver had replied without looking up. "Word travels fast here." "May I speak with you for a moment?" Weaver had gestured to an empty chair beside him. "Free country, still. For some of us, anyway." Pierce had seated himself and taken out his notebook. "I'm researching the disappearances that have occurred on Crowley Ridge. I understand you're somewhat of an expert on the mountain." Weaver's knife had paused briefly before resuming its steady work. "Not much to be an expert about. Just a mountain. A mountain where 2 children have vanished without a trace. Children go missing everywhere. Nature isn't kind. But it's more than that, isn't it?" Pierce had pressed. "Something was found in those caves, something that caused people to leave town, something no one will talk about." Weaver had finally looked at him, his gaze sharp despite his age. "You asking questions about things you don't understand, Mr. Pierce. Dangerous way to live. I understand that people deserve the truth." "Truth?" Weaver had almost spat the word. "What makes you think you'd recognize it if you heard it? What makes you think anyone would believe it if you printed it?" "Try me." Weaver had stared at him for a long moment before setting aside his carving and knife. "You know anything about the history of these mountains? Before the white man came?" Pierce had admitted his knowledge was limited. "These mountains are old," Weaver had said, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality, as if reciting something memorized long ago. "Older than the nations that fought over them. Older than the people who first put names to them. In the old days, the Cherokee had stories about Crowley, though they called it by a different name. They said it was a hungry place, a place that took what it wanted." "You're saying the mountain is supernatural?" Pierce had asked, skepticism evident in his tone. Weaver had laughed, a harsh sound like dry leaves scraping against stone. "Nothing supernatural about hunger, Mr. Pierce. It's the most natural thing there is. Every living thing hungers. Difference is just in what they hunger for." "And what does Crowley hunger for?" Weaver had not answered directly. Instead, he had picked up his carving again, turning it over in his gnarled hands. "First settlers here, back before there was a Fayetteville, they knew to leave that mountain be, built their homes with their backs to it, taught their children to stay away, but people forget. Or they get curious, or greedy." "The caves," Pierce had prompted. "Caves go deep," Weaver had said, "deeper than anyone's mapped. Some connect to the old mine shafts, though the company denies it. Some go places no man's ever been." He had paused. "Or at least no man who's come back to tell of it." "The Harlan boy, Thomas, you took him to these caves?" "Showed him the entrance only. Told him never to go inside alone. Boy was curious, though. Smart, too. Too smart for his own good." "You think he went back alone?" Weaver had shrugged. "Can't say. All I know is there's things in this world older than our understanding of it. Things that don't fit in your newspapers or history books." "What was found in the cave after the Collins girl disappeared?" Pierce had pressed. Weaver had fixed him with a steady gaze. "You really want to know? Go ask James Harlan. He was there. Go ask why he burned his clothes when he got home that day. Go ask why he won't let his wife or daughter out of the house after dark anymore. Go ask why he keeps a loaded shotgun by the door now." Pierce had thanked Weaver for his time and walked back to town as darkness fell, the old man's words echoing in his mind. That night he had written in his journal for several hours before finally extinguishing his lamp well after midnight. The next morning he had gone to the mine, just as the day shift was ending. He had positioned himself near the entrance, watching as the coal-blackened men emerged into the fading daylight. He had recognized James Harlan from descriptions, a tall man with broad shoulders, now slightly stooped, as if carrying an invisible weight. "Mr. Harlan," Pierce had called out, "a moment of your time, please." James had stopped, turning slowly to face him. The other miners had given them a wide berth, continuing toward town without looking back. "Who are you?" James had asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Jonathan Pierce, Pittsburgh Gazette. I'd like to ask you about what happened to your son, and about what you found in the cave on Crowley Ridge." For a long moment James had simply stared at him, his expression unreadable behind the coal dust that covered his features. Then, in a movement so sudden it caught Pierce off guard, he had lunged forward, grabbing the journalist by the lapels and slamming him against the wooden support beam near the mine entrance. "You listen to me," James had hissed, his face inches from Pierce's. "You get on the next train out of Fayetteville. You forget whatever you think you know about my boy or that mountain. You never come back here. You never write a word about any of it. Because if you do—" He had left the threat unfinished, but his meaning had been clear. Pierce had been escorted to the train station by Sheriff Donovan that afternoon. "For your own safety," the sheriff had explained, though his tone had suggested it was Pierce who presented the danger rather than the other way around. As the train pulled away from Fayetteville, Pierce had looked out the window and caught a glimpse of Crowley Ridge, rising above the town, its slopes dark with pine forests, its peak obscured by low-hanging clouds. Nothing about it had seemed particularly threatening in the fading autumn light. Yet he had felt a chill as he watched it recede from view. 3 weeks later, the Pittsburgh Gazette had published a small article on page 17 about the economic challenges facing coal mining communities in West Virginia. There had been no mention of Fayetteville, Crowley Ridge, or missing children. Jonathan Pierce had returned to his apartment in Pittsburgh, filed his story, and attempted to put the matter behind him. But the questions remained, gnawing at him like a hunger that could not be satisfied. What had been found in that cave? What secret was the town of Fayetteville protecting? And why had the Harlan boy and the Collins girl been drawn to that mountain? On November 30th, 1907, Pierce had boarded a train back to West Virginia. He had not told his editor where he was going or why. He had packed light, just a single suitcase containing clothes, his notebooks, and a small revolver he had purchased after his confrontation with James Harlan. He had not gone directly to Fayetteville this time. Instead, he had disembarked at Charleston and hired a local guide familiar with the region. Together, they had approached Crowley Ridge from the south, avoiding Fayetteville entirely. The guide, a weathered man named Jackson with a pronounced limp, had been reluctant to take him anywhere near the mountain. "Bad reputation, that place," Jackson had muttered as they made camp the first night. "Hunters avoid it. Even the game seems scarcer around there." "Have you heard stories about it?" Pierce had asked. Jackson had poked at their small fire with a stick, his expression troubled. "Heard things. Don't know what's true, and what's just talk. They say there's caves up there that go all the way down to hell itself. Say if you listen at the entrances on certain nights, you can hear voices calling from inside, calling your name, even if you've never been there before." "And do you believe that?" Jackson had shrugged. "Don't matter what I believe, I just know I won't be going up there with you. I'll take you to the base of the ridge, show you the old logging trails that lead up. After that, you're on your own." True to his word, Jackson had left Pierce at the foot of Crowley Ridge the next morning. The journalist had begun his ascent alone, following a barely visible trail that wound through the dense undergrowth. The November air had been cold and still, the forest unnaturally quiet around him. By mid-afternoon he had climbed high enough to see Fayetteville in the distance, a small collection of buildings nestled in the valley below. From this vantage point it had looked peaceful, ordinary, a typical mining town, like dozens of others scattered throughout the mountains. Pierce had continued upward, making notes in his journal as he went. He had recorded the unusual silence of the forest, the lack of wildlife, the way the trees seemed to grow at strange angles the higher he climbed. Near dusk, he had found what appeared to be the remains of an old campsite, a circle of stones surrounding the ashes of a long dead fire. Beside it, half buried in the accumulated leaves of several seasons, he had discovered a small metal object. Brushing away the debris, he had revealed a child's lunch pail, rusted but recognizable. Inside was the remnant of what might once have been a sandwich, now nothing more than a moldering crust. Pierce had carefully noted this discovery, packaging the lunch pail in his handkerchief and placing it in his satchel. As darkness approached, he had made camp beneath an overhanging rock formation that provided some shelter from the wind that had begun to rise. He had not slept well. The wind had increased throughout the night, moving through the trees with a sound uncomfortably like whispers. Once he had been certain he had heard his name called from the darkness beyond his small fire. He had dismissed it as the product of an overtired mind influenced by Jackson's stories. Morning had brought a heavy mist that clung to the mountainside, reducing visibility to mere yards. Pierce had considered waiting for it to clear, but had decided to press on, following what he believed to be the most likely route a curious child might take. By noon he had found the cave. The entrance had been much as it had been described to him, narrow, partially hidden by undergrowth, with a small clearing before it. The ground around the entrance had been oddly bare, as if regularly cleared of fallen leaves and debris. Pierce had approached cautiously, noting the unusual smoothness of the stone around the opening, as if it had been worn by frequent passage. He had hesitated at the threshold, struck by an inexplicable reluctance that seemed to seep from the darkness beyond. Overcoming it with an effort of will, he had lit his lantern and entered, crawling at first until the passage widened enough for him to stand. The cave's interior had been unexpectedly warm and dry. The walls had glistened with moisture in the lantern light, reflecting it in ways that created shifting patterns of shadow and illumination. Pierce had moved forward slowly, one hand trailing along the wall for guidance, the other holding the lantern high. The passage had descended at a gentle slope for perhaps 100 yards before opening into a larger chamber. Here Pierce had stopped, raising his lantern to better illuminate the space. The chamber was roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, with a ceiling high enough that his light could not reach it. Several smaller passages led off from this central space, disappearing into darkness. But it was what covered the walls that had caused Pierce to draw in a sharp breath. The stone surfaces were covered with drawings, hundreds of them etched into the rock and enhanced with what appeared to be various natural pigments. Some were clearly ancient, crude representations of human figures, animals, and abstract symbols that might have been created thousands of years ago. Others seemed more recent, the lines sharper, the pigments brighter. Pierce had moved closer to examine them, his journalist's mind cataloging and analyzing. Many of the drawings depicted what appeared to be hunting scenes, human figures pursuing animals through stylized landscapes. Others showed what might have been religious ceremonies, groups gathered around central figures that wore elaborate headdresses or carried staffs. But interspersed among these familiar prehistoric motifs were images that seemed out of place, unsettling in their incongruity. Figures that were not quite human, with elongated limbs and features that seemed to shift and blur the longer Pierce stared at them. Scenes that depicted not hunting, but something more disturbing, the not quite human figures pursuing what were clearly intended to be people, dragging them toward dark openings in the earth. And most disturbing of all, near the floor of the chamber, drawn in what appeared to be relatively fresh pigment, was a childlike rendering of a house, a two-story structure with a peaked roof and 4 windows. Beside it stood 5 stick figures, 2 large, 3 small. One of the smaller figures had been crossed out with a series of angry lines. Pierce had carefully photographed as many of the drawings as possible, the flash of his camera momentarily filling the chamber with harsh light, before plunging it back into the softer glow of his lantern. He had made sketches as well, and extensive notes describing what he saw. Finished with his documentation of the main chamber, he had turned his attention to the smaller passages leading away from it. After a moment's consideration, he had chosen the one that seemed most frequently used, judging by the smoothness of the floor and the absence of dust. This passage had twisted and turned, descending deeper into the mountain. The air had grown noticeably warmer, with an underlying odor that Pierce had found difficult to identify. Something organic, yet unfamiliar, like meat left too long in the sun, but with a strange, almost sweet undertone. The passage had eventually opened into a second chamber, smaller than the first but with a similar circular shape. Here, there were no drawings on the walls. Instead, the floor had been covered with objects, hundreds of them, arranged in what appeared to be deliberate patterns. Pierce had moved among them cautiously, his lantern illuminating each in turn. There were children's toys, dolls with missing limbs, wooden trains with broken wheels, marbles, tops, and jacks. There were personal items, hairbrushes with strands still caught in the bristles, combs, hand mirrors, and hair ribbons. There were tools, hammers, saws, and knives, many rusted with what might have been blood or simply the passage of time. And there were more intimate items, teeth, carefully arranged in concentric circles, locks of hair of various colors and lengths, braided together into complex patterns, small bones that Pierce had desperately hoped belonged to animals. In the center of this disturbing collection had been a cleared space containing only 2 items: a child's primer, its pages yellow with age but otherwise intact, and a small metal lunch pail identical to the one Pierce had found the previous day, but in pristine condition. Pierce had photographed everything, his hands shaking so badly at times that he had feared the images would be unusable. He had made notes as well, though his usually neat handwriting had become increasingly erratic as he worked. He had been so absorbed in his documentation that he had not immediately noticed the change in the air, a subtle shift in pressure, a whisper of movement from one of the passages leading from the chamber. When he had finally become aware of it, he had frozen, lantern raised, listening intently. Nothing. No sound but his own breathing, too loud in the confined space. No movement but the flickering shadows cast by his lantern. Yet he had been suddenly, absolutely certain that he was no longer alone. "Hello?" he had called, his voice sounding thin and fragile in the darkness. "Is someone there?" No answer had come, but the sensation of being watched had intensified. Pierce had turned slowly, scanning the chamber and the entrances to the various passages. His light had revealed nothing unusual, nothing moving in the shadows. He had decided it was time to leave. He had gathered his camera, notebook, and the primer from the center of the collection, placing them carefully in his satchel. As he had straightened, his lantern had flickered momentarily, casting the chamber into near-total darkness before brightening again. In that brief moment of darkness, Pierce had heard it, a soft shuffling sound from the passage through which he had entered, a sound like bare feet moving across stone. "Who's there?" he had called again, directing his lantern toward the passage. The light had revealed nothing but empty space. Pierce had moved toward the exit, walking as quickly as he dared given the uneven floor and the precarious arrangement of objects. As he had reached the passage, he had hesitated, a primal instinct warning him against entering the narrow confines where he would be vulnerable from behind. He had turned once more, surveying the chamber a final time. His lantern light had fallen on the cleared space in the center where the primer had been. The lunch pail was gone. Pierce had run then, all pretense of scientific documentation abandoned. He had dashed through the passage, his lantern swinging wildly, casting monstrous, leaping shadows on the walls. He had tripped once, falling hard, the impact sending pain shooting through his knee and elbow. He had scrambled up immediately, not bothering to check the extent of his injuries. The main chamber had appeared empty when he had burst into it, but the drawings on the walls had seemed different somehow. The figures more angular, the not-quite-human forms more numerous, their features more distinct. Pierce had not stopped to examine them. He had crossed the chamber at a run and plunged into the passage that led to the entrance. The crawl back through the narrow section near the exit had been agonizing, his injured knee screaming in protest, his breathing harsh and ragged in the confined space. When he had finally emerged into the gray light of late afternoon, he had collapsed on the ground, gulping the fresh air gratefully. He had allowed himself only a moment's rest before struggling to his feet. The mist had cleared during his time underground, revealing a sky heavy with the promise of snow. Pierce had oriented himself and begun his descent, moving as quickly as his injured knee would allow. Night had fallen before he was halfway down the mountain. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the promised snow had begun to fall, fat wet flakes that had quickly covered the ground and obscured the trail. Pierce had continued doggedly, using his lantern to light his way, stopping occasionally to consult his compass. He had been perhaps a mile from the base of the ridge when he had heard it again, that soft, shuffling sound, this time from somewhere in the darkness beyond his lantern's reach. He had paused, listening intently, the hair on the back of his neck rising. "Who's there?" he had called, his voice sounding small against the vastness of the night and the mountain. A twig had snapped somewhere to his left. Pierce had swung his lantern in that direction, its light reflecting off the falling snow but revealing nothing beyond. He had quickened his pace, sliding more than walking down the increasingly slippery slope. The sounds had continued. A rustle here, a snap there, all was just at the edge of his perception, all was moving parallel to his path, rather than approaching directly. By the time he had reached the base of the ridge, Pierce had been running, heedless of the pain in his knee or the treacherous footing. He had burst from the tree line onto the flatter ground of the valley with a gasp of relief that had quickly turned to dismay. In the darkness and snow, with only a compass to guide him, he had veered off course. Instead of the road where he had left Jackson, he had emerged near what appeared to be a small homestead, a single cabin with light glowing from its windows, a thin stream of smoke rising from its chimney. Pierce had approached cautiously, unsure of his reception, but desperate for shelter, and directions. As he had drawn nearer, he had recognized the cabin, Abel Weaver's home at the edge of Fayetteville. He had hesitated, weighing his options. Behind him lay the mountain and whatever had stalked him down its slopes. Ahead, a man who might offer help or might alert the town to his return. In the end, the choice had been simple. He had approached the cabin and knocked firmly on the door. Weaver had answered quickly, as if he had been expecting a visitor. His rheumy eyes had widened slightly at the sight of Pierce, snow-covered and disheveled, but he had stepped back silently to allow the journalist entry. The cabin's interior had been warm and surprisingly neat. A fire burned in the small stone fireplace, and a kettle steamed on the iron stove in the corner. Weaver had gestured Pierce toward a chair near the fire, and wordlessly brought him a cup of hot tea. "You went up there," Weaver had said finally. It was not a question. Pierce had nodded, his hands wrapped around the warm cup. "I found the cave. I saw what's inside." "And did it see you?" The question had sent a chill through Pierce despite the warmth of the fire. "What do you mean?" Weaver had settled into a chair opposite him, his weathered face grave. "The mountain has eyes, Mr. Pierce. It watches, it chooses, it takes." "You're talking as if the mountain itself is alive." "Not the mountain," Weaver had said, shaking his head slowly. "What lives within it, what has always lived within it, the old ones." "The hungry ones? You expect me to believe in some kind of creatures living inside Crowley Ridge? Creatures that take children?" "I don't expect you to believe anything. Truth doesn't require belief to remain true." Weaver had leaned forward, his eyes suddenly sharp and clear. "But I do expect you to answer a question. When you were in that cave, in that room with all the collections, did you take anything?" Pierce's hand had moved unconsciously to his satchel, where the primer rested alongside his notebooks and camera. "I documented everything for my article." Weaver's expression had darkened. "You took something that belongs to them. That was your mistake." "Them?" "The hungry ones, the watchers, the old ones. Call them what you will. They've been here since before the first people came to these mountains. They've taken tribute for as long as there have been settlements nearby." "Tribute? You're talking about human sacrifice?" Weaver had laughed, that same harsh sound Pierce had heard during their previous conversation. "Not sacrifice, hunger. They feed, not on flesh, or not only on flesh, on fear, on innocence, on potential." "You're saying they eat children? The Harlan boy? The Collins girl?" "Eat. No. Consume, perhaps. Absorb. Become. The children who go to the mountain become part of it, part of them. In time." Pierce had set down his cup, unable to keep his hands from shaking. "And the town knows about this? They allow it to happen?" "The town survives," Weaver had said simply. "Every few years a child wanders too far, a child feels the call of the mountain, and the town mourns, and the town continues." "What would you have them do? Leave? Abandon their homes, their livelihoods? Where would they go that would be safer? The world is full of hungry things, Mr. Pierce. And you? What's your role in all this? You showed Thomas Harlan the caves. I showed him the entrance only, warned him to stay away." Weaver had sighed, suddenly looking every one of his many years. "I watch, I record, I remember. Someone has to know the truth, even if it can never be spoken." "I'm going to speak it," Pierce had said, his journalist's determination reasserting itself. "I'm going to write about what happens here. People need to know. And who will believe you? Who will accept that something exists in these mountains that defies all modern understanding? Something that has existed for thousands of years, feeding on the young, growing stronger with each generation? I have evidence, photographs, the primer, my notes." Weaver had looked at him with something like pity. "And you think you'll be allowed to leave with those? You think you'll make it out of Fayetteville alive if Sheriff Donovan or James Harlan learn you've returned? They're protecting child killers. They're protecting their way of life, their families, the children who haven't been taken. The sacrifice of the few for the many is an old bargain, Mr. Pierce. Older than Christianity, older than civilization itself." Pierce had risen unsteadily to his feet. "I need to go. I need to get back to Pittsburgh to write my story." Weaver had not moved to stop him. "The snow is heavy. The road to the station will be impassable until morning. Stay here tonight. Rest. Consider what I've said." Pierce had hesitated, torn between his desire to put as much distance as possible between himself and Crowley Ridge and the practical reality of traveling in a snowstorm at night. Finally he had nodded. "Until morning. Then I'm leaving." Weaver had shown him to a small back room containing a narrow bed. "Sleep if you can," the old man had said, "but I wouldn't count on it, not with what you carry in that satchel." Pierce had closed the door behind Weaver and sat on the edge of the bed, his satchel clutched to his chest. Despite his exhaustion, he had known sleep would be elusive. His mind had raced with what he had seen, what Weaver had told him, and the article he would write that would expose it all. He had reached into his satchel and withdrawn the primer he had taken from the cave. It was a standard McGuffey reader, the kind used in schools throughout the country. He had opened it carefully, turning the yellowed pages. Inside the front cover, written in a child's careful script, was a name, Thomas Harlan. Pierce had flipped through the book, looking for any other markings or clues. Near the middle, he had found several pages where words had been circled in pencil. Reading them in sequence, he had felt a chill creep up his spine. "I, hear, them, calling, me, from, inside, the mountain." He had closed the book quickly, returning it to his satchel. Sleep now seemed impossible. He had moved to the small window, pulling back the rough curtain to peer outside. The snow was falling heavily, transforming the landscape into an unrecognizable white expanse. In the distance, barely visible through the swirling flakes, Crowley Ridge loomed like a shadow against the night sky. As he had watched, Pierce had thought he saw movement on the edge of the clearing before Weaver's cabin, a darker shadow moving against the whiteness of the snow. He had squinted, trying to make out details. For a moment he had been certain he had seen a figure standing there, small, child-sized, watching the cabin with unblinking attention. Then the wind had gusted, driving the snow into a blinding sheet, and when it had cleared, there had been nothing visible but the unbroken expanse of white. Pierce had let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the bed, lying down fully clothed, his satchel beside him. Despite his certainty that he would remain awake, exhaustion had eventually claimed him, pulling him into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of dark passages, watching eyes, and children's voices calling his name from deep within the earth. He had awakened to silence. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the world outside muffled and transformed. Pale morning light had filtered through the curtains, casting the small room in a gray glow. Pierce had reached for his satchel, reassuring himself that it was still there, still contained his evidence. Then he had risen, straightened his rumpled clothes as best he could, and opened the door to the main room of the cabin. Weaver had been sitting by the fire, which had burned down to embers during the night. He had not turned as Pierce entered, but had spoken as if continuing a conversation already in progress. "They came in the night," he had said, his voice oddly flat. "While you slept, they stood outside, watching the cabin, waiting." Pierce had felt his mouth go dry. "Who came? The hungry ones, or perhaps their emissaries, the ones who have already been taken, who now serve them. Hard to tell the difference after a while. You're trying to frighten me? No need for that. You're already frightened, as you should be." Weaver had finally turned to look at him, his face gaunt in the dim light. "You took something that belongs to them. They want it back." "The primer? It belonged to Thomas Harlan." "It belongs to them now, as does Thomas Harlan." Pierce had squared his shoulders. "I'm leaving now. The snow has stopped. I can make it to the station." Weaver had nodded slowly. "Perhaps, if they allow it. I'm not afraid of superstition or ghost stories." "Then you've understood nothing." Weaver had risen stiffly, moving to the window to look out at the snow-covered landscape. "They're real, Mr. Pierce. As real as you or I. Older, certainly. Different in ways we can barely comprehend, but real, physical, hungry." Pierce had checked his pocket watch. If he hurried, he might catch the morning train to Charleston, and from there, connect to Pittsburgh. "Thank you for the shelter," he had said formally. I won't forget what you've told me, even if I don't believe all of it." Weaver had not responded, his gaze fixed on something outside the window. After a moment he had spoken, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're still here, watching, waiting for you to emerge." Pierce had joined him at the window, peering out cautiously. The clearing before the cabin had been pristine, the snow unbroken except for a single set of tracks that led from the tree line to within a few yards of the cabin, then stopped abruptly, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished or risen into the air. "Animal tracks," Pierce had said, trying to convince himself as much as Weaver. "If you say so." Pierce had gathered his satchel and moved to the door. "Goodbye, Mr. Weaver. I hope you'll be safe here." "I've been safe for 70 years, Mr. Pierce. I watch, I record, I remember, I don't interfere. That's the bargain." "What bargain?" "The one I made when I was young, when I first came to these mountains and learned what lived within them. The price of knowledge is complicity, Mr. Pierce. Remember that when you write your article, if you live to write it." Pierce had left without further comment, stepping out into the bright, cold morning. The snow had been deep, reaching mid-calf in places, making his progress slow and laborious. He had followed what he believed to be the path toward town, frequently checking his compass to ensure he maintained the correct direction. The forest had been eerily silent around him, the snow dampening even the sound of his own labored breathing. No birds called, no small animals moved in the underbrush. It was as if the entire mountain held its breath, watching and waiting. Pierce had been perhaps halfway to town when he had heard it, a soft crunching sound behind him, the sound of footsteps in snow. He had turned quickly, but the path behind him had been empty, the snow unmarked except for his own tracks. He had quickened his pace, fighting against the drag of the snow and the persistent ache in his injured knee. The sounds had continued, sometimes behind him, sometimes to one side or the other, always just out of sight. Once he had caught a glimpse of movement among the trees, a small, dark shape that had vanished when he tried to focus on it. The sun had risen higher, beginning to melt the snow in patches where its light penetrated the canopy of pine branches. Pierce had been able to move more quickly then, though his clothing had become wet and uncomfortable, chilling him despite his exertion. As he had neared the outskirts of Fayetteville, the sounds that had followed him had faded, replaced by the normal noises of a town awakening, distant voices, the clang of metal on metal from the blacksmith's shop, the bark of a dog. Pierce had felt his tension ease slightly as he had emerged from the forest onto a recognizable road. His relief had been short-lived. As he had approached the first buildings of the town, he had seen a familiar figure standing in the middle of the road, waiting. Sheriff Donovan, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. "Thought I told you not to come back, Mr. Pierce," Donovan had called as the journalist came within earshot. Pierce had stopped, calculating his options. "I'm just passing through, Sheriff," heading for the station to catch the morning train. "Is that so?" Donovan had taken a few steps forward. "And what might you have been doing up on Crowley Ridge yesterday? Several people saw you heading that way." "Just research for my article. The one about the economic challenges facing mining communities, remember? Funny kind of research that takes a man into caves where he has no business being." Pierce had felt a chill that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Donovan's hand had tightened on his pistol. "I think you've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. I think you've seen things you shouldn't have seen, taken things that don't belong to you. If you're referring to evidence of what happens to children in this town, I'm referring to the natural order of things, Mr. Pierce, the way things have always been, the way they need to be for the rest of us to survive. By sacrificing children to some thing living in that mountain?" Donovan's expression had not changed. "Sacrificing? No. We don't choose. We don't send them up there. They go on their own. They hear the call. Some do, some don't. Those that do belong to the mountain, always have. And you just let it happen. The whole town just accepts it. What would you have us do? Fight it? Leave? This is our home. Has been for generations. Will be for generations more. The mountain takes what it needs. Not often, just enough. And in return, it lets us live here, work here, raise our families here. That's monstrous. That's survival. Donovan had drawn his pistol now, holding it casually at his side. And speaking of survival, Mr. Pierce, I'm afraid yours has become somewhat unlikely. You see, the mountain doesn't just take children. Sometimes it takes those who interfere, those who threaten the arrangement. Pierce had taken a step backward. You're going to shoot me? In broad daylight? On the main road into town? Donovan had smiled thinly. No need for that. There won't be any evidence connecting me or anyone else in Fayetteville to what's about to happen to you. The mountain takes care of its own problems. As if on cue, Pierce had heard it again, that soft shuffling sound, now coming from multiple directions at once. He had turned, scanning the tree line, and had seen them, small, shadowy figures moving among the pines, their features indistinct, their movements unnaturally fluid. What are they? He had whispered, unable to tear his gaze away. They were children once, Donovan had replied, his voice oddly gentle. Now they're something else. The mountain changes those it takes, shapes them to its needs. The figures had been drawing closer, emerging from the forest onto the snow-covered road. As they had moved into the sunlight, Pierce had been able to see them more clearly, and had immediately wished he couldn't. They had been child-sized, but no longer entirely human. Their limbs had been too long, too jointed. Their faces had been smooth, featureless, except for dark hollows where eyes should have been. They had moved with a strange, gliding grace, their feet barely seeming to touch the ground. And leading them a few paces ahead of the others had been a figure that Pierce had recognized with a shock of horror. A boy of about 9 with a familiar face now made strange by something that lurked behind the eyes, something ancient and hungry. Thomas Harlan, Pierce had breathed. The boy thing had smiled, a too wide expression that had revealed teeth that were no longer entirely human. "Hello, mister." "Pierce," it had said in a voice that was both a child's and something else entirely. "You have something that belongs to us." Pierce had clutched his satchel tighter. "Stay back." Donovan had holstered his pistol and stepped aside, clearing the path between Pierce and the approaching figures. "Nothing personal, Mr. Pierce," he had said. "Just the way things have to be." Pierce had looked from the sheriff to the inhuman children advancing toward him, and had made the only choice available. He had turned and run, not toward the town where no help would be forthcoming, but along the road that led toward the train station, still miles distant. He had heard them behind him, those soft, shuffling footsteps somehow keeping pace despite his desperate sprint. He had not looked back, focusing only on the road ahead, on the distant hope of escape. He had been perhaps a quarter-mile beyond the town limits when he had heard the train whistle in the distance, the morning train to Charleston arriving on schedule. If he could reach it before it departed again, his lungs had burned, his injured knee threatening to collapse with each pounding step. The snow had made the road treacherous, hiding ruts and holes that could send him sprawling if he failed to see them in time. The footsteps behind him had grown closer. He had risked a glance over his shoulder and had seen them gaining, a dozen or more of the changed children, moving with that unnatural grace, their faces fixed in those terrible, not quite human smiles. And at their head, Thomas Harlan, his face now split in a grin that extended literally from ear to ear, revealing row upon row of needle-like teeth. Pierce had faced forward again, pushing himself harder. The road had curved ahead, and as he had rounded the bend, he had seen it. The train station, a small wooden structure beside the tracks. The train had been there, smoke billowing from its stack, passengers disembarking on the platform. He had redoubled his efforts, waving his arms as he ran, trying to attract the attention of the conductor who stood by the passenger car. "Wait!" he had shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "Wait for me!" Whether the conductor had heard him or not, the man had raised his watch, checked it, and then signaled to the engineer. The train had begun to move, slowly at first, gathering speed as it pulled away from the station. Pierce had reached the platform just as the last car had begun to pass. With a desperate lunge, he had caught the railing of the rear platform and pulled himself aboard, collapsing onto the wooden deck, gasping for breath. When he had finally found the strength to raise his head and look back, the platform had been empty. No inhuman children, no Thomas Harlan with his impossible smile. Just the small, weathered station building, and, beyond it, the road leading back to Fayetteville and Crowley Ridge rising against the sky. Pierce had struggled to his feet and made his way into the passenger car, finding an empty seat near the back. He had placed his satchel carefully on his lap, reassuring himself that his evidence was still intact: his notebooks, his camera with its precious film, and the primer with its circled message. As the train had pulled farther from Fayetteville, Pierce had felt the tension begin to ease from his body. He was safe. He had escaped. He would write his article, expose the horror that lurked in Crowley Ridge, and ensure that no more children would be taken. He had been so absorbed in these thoughts that he had not immediately noticed the small figure that had slipped into the seat beside him. When he had finally become aware of his companion, he had turned to find Thomas Harlan sitting there, looking like a normal 9-year-old boy, except for the unsettling darkness behind his eyes. "Hello again, Mr. Pierce," Thomas had said pleasantly. "We have a long journey ahead of us." Pierce had tried to scream, but no sound had emerged from his throat. He had tried to rise, to flee to another car, but his limbs had refused to obey his commands. He had been able only to sit paralyzed as Thomas had reached over and gently taken the satchel from his unresisting hands. "Thank you for returning my primer," the boy thing had said, removing the book and placing it carefully in his own pocket. "I've missed it. It's so hard to remember who you were before. This helps." Pierce had managed to force a whisper past his frozen vocal cords. "What are you?" Thomas had tilted his head, considering the question. "I am Thomas Harlan. And I am also something else, something older, something that has always lived in the mountain, something that needs to feed. On children, on potential, on futures, on all the things a child might become." Thomas had smiled, and for a moment his face had flickered, showing the inhuman grin beneath the human mask. "The mountain grows hungry again, Mr. Pierce. It has sent me to find new feeding grounds. Places where children might hear its call, even from a distance." "Pittsburgh," Pierce had whispered, understanding dawning with horrifying clarity. "Pittsburgh, New York, Chicago, anywhere your article might be read, anywhere curious minds might learn of Crowley Ridge and begin to wonder, to dream about it, to hear its whispers in their sleep." Thomas had patted the satchel. "Your notes will be very helpful. Your photographs, too. They captured more than you realized." "I'll stop you." "I'll warn people?" "No, Mr. Pierce, you won't." Thomas had leaned closer, his breath cold against Pierce's cheek. "Because you're coming back to the mountain with me. You've seen too much, learned too much. The mountain is hungry for you now." "The train? We're miles away already." Thomas had laughed, a sound like falling stones. "Distance means nothing to the mountain, Mr. Pierce. It reaches where it wishes to reach. It takes what it wishes to take." He had gestured toward the window. "Look." Pierce had turned his head with painful slowness, fighting against the paralysis that held him. Outside the window, the landscape had been wrong. Not the rolling hills and small farms that should have surrounded the train tracks, but dense forest, the trees pressing close to the rails. And beyond them, rising impossible and immediate, had been Crowley Ridge, its slopes dark and forbidding in the morning light. "You never left," Thomas had said softly. "None who hear the mountain's call ever truly leave." The train had slowed, though no station was visible ahead. It had come to a complete stop in the middle of the forest, the engine's hiss the only sound in the sudden silence. Pierce had looked around the passenger car, expecting to see other travelers reacting to this unexpected delay. The car had been empty except for him and Thomas. Empty and changed. The upholstered seats now weathered and torn, the windows clouded with grime, the floor littered with dead leaves as if the car had been abandoned for years. "Time works differently for the mountain," Thomas had said, answering Pierce's unspoken question. "What seems like moments can be years. What seems like distance can be illusion." Pierce had felt his paralysis begin to ease, not from any lessening of whatever force Thomas exerted, but simply because his terror had begun to transform into a strange, fatalistic calm. "What happens now?" Thomas had stood, gesturing for Pierce to follow. "Now you come with me, into the mountain, into the dark. You'll see everything you wanted to see. Learn everything you wanted to learn." His smile had widened, becoming once more that impossible grin. "And then you'll help us find more children. Help us feed the hunger that never ends." Pierce had risen, his movements no longer his own. He had followed Thomas from the train, down steps that crumbled beneath their weight, onto ground that felt strangely insubstantial. They had walked into the forest toward the looming presence of Crowley Ridge. Behind them, the train had faded like mist in the morning sun, leaving no trace of its passing. As they had approached the base of the ridge, Pierce had seen them waiting, the not-quite-human children, standing silent and watchful among the trees. They had parted to create a path leading toward a cave entrance that Pierce had not seen before, larger than the one he had explored, its mouth a gaping wound in the side of the mountain. Thomas had stopped at the threshold, turning to Pierce with an expression that might almost have been pity. "It won't hurt," he had said, "not for long, and afterward you'll understand. You'll be part of something ancient, something hungry, something that will never die." Pierce had wanted to resist, to run, to scream, but his body had continued forward, step by inexorable step, into the darkness of the cave. The last thing he had seen before the shadows engulfed him had been Thomas Harlan's face, the human mask slipping away to reveal what lay beneath, something with too many eyes, too many teeth, and a hunger older than history. Jonathan Pierce never returned to Pittsburgh. His employers at the Gazette, after making inquiries with the railway company and the authorities in West Virginia, eventually listed him as missing, presumed deceased. His personal effects, found in his apartment, were sent to his elderly mother in Philadelphia. Among them was a half-written article about the economic challenges facing coal mining communities. Nothing about Fayetteville, nothing about Crowley Ridge, nothing about missing children. Life in Fayetteville continued as it always had. The mine operated, the school taught, the church prayed. Children were watched more carefully for a time, but eventually the vigilance eased. Human memory is short, and the rhythm of daily life has a way of obscuring even the most disturbing events. In the spring of 1908, Sarah Harlan planted flowers around the small marker in the cemetery that bore her son's name, though no body lay beneath it. James worked in the mine, his back a little more stooped each year. Robert eventually married a girl from a neighboring town and moved away. Mary remained at home, quiet and watchful as always. Abel Weaver continued to sit on his porch, whittling his curious figures, watching the mountain with knowing eyes. The townsfolk still avoided him, crossing to the other side of the road when they passed his cabin, but the more overt hostility had faded. He was simply part of the landscape now, like the church, the mine, and Crowley Ridge itself. And on the ridge, in the caves that went deeper than any map showed, something ancient and hungry waited patiently for the next curious child to wander too far, to hear the whispers that came from beneath the earth, to feel the pull of a mystery too compelling to resist. In October of 1909, a new family moved to Fayetteville, a mine engineer named Harrison, his wife, and their 3 children. They purchased a house at the edge of town, with a clear view of Crowley Ridge from the kitchen window. Their youngest child, a boy of 10 named Daniel, often stood at that window staring at the mountain with an expression of unusual intensity. Sometimes his mother would find him there in the middle of the night, whispering words she couldn't quite catch. When she asked what he was looking at, he always gave the same answer. "They're calling me, Ma, the children in the mountain. They say they have something to show me." By December, Daniel Harrison had begun collecting things, interesting stones, unusual feathers, discarded tools that he repurposed into toys. His pockets were always full, his mind always working. The mountain watched, the mountain waited, the mountain hungered, and in time, as it always did, the mountain called.